Thanks everyone for being here today. My name is David. I run an organization called Funding the Commons, which is a public goods funding event series incubated by Protocol Labs. We do conferences, hackathons, and open source developer residencies around the world. Today I'll be speaking a little bit about the current landscape of public goods funding in Web3. So wanted to define kind of first the scope of this conversation, because public goods as a term are thrown around very loosely. Usually it's for a specific ecosystem. In this case, we're talking about open source. Is the mic working well? Yeah. Okay. Open source software applied to Web3 ecosystems doesn't have to be Solidity, doesn't have to be a specific language, but used by Web3 ecosystems. So talk a little bit about the landscape. First, we have more traditional grants, which are much broader than Web3, and you're all familiar with them, so I won't go too deep into that. Retroactive funding is something that is emerging very quickly. I don't know if anyone's here earlier today for Juan's announcement of the Filecoin RetroPGF? Yeah? All right, so today Filecoin announced their own RetroPGF rounds, which are launching basically next month. And so that's a big opportunity for projects in this ecosystem. Optimism has been leading that. They just completed a 30 million OP distribution, something like 90 million US dollars to, I think, 500 projects.
libp was number 5.
Yeah, libp2p, IPFS scored like really, really high. That was great to see other ecosystems outside of PL starting to fund these public goods. Drips is another one that's come out of this ecosystem. Radical team is behind that, doing open source dependency funding, so you can fund your own dependencies or dependencies of other projects that you believe in. And I put airdrops on here because it's getting to about $1 billion a month, and I would classify this as a form of public goods funding, albeit a pretty inefficient one. But $1 billion a month is like government level funding, as people outside of Web3 have informed me, so it's not something to ignore. And you know, the intention of a lot of these airdrops is to retroactively reward users and contributors to the ecosystem. And crowdfunding. Mainly here talking about donation-based crowdfunding, but I'll get into other forms of crowdfunding in a bit. So Gitcoin you're all familiar with, just had a great presentation. Octant came out of Golem Foundation, one of the first public goods funding ICO campaigns about 8 years ago. That was like, as the founders explained to me, an attempt at a true ICO as a form of public goods funding to create open source software. Golem Foundation, Golem split into two. So one team is still trying to build the decentralized compute project, and the other side, Golem Foundation, launched something called Octant, which is basically a way for the holders of the token, the GLM token, to donate their yield of the treasury, the ETH treasury of Golem, that they could otherwise claim themselves, but you can donate it at leverage, something like 40x leverage, which is pretty crazy. So donate $100, match 4K to public goods, mainly Ethereum ecosystem. We're gonna try to get IPFS and libp2p in there for the upcoming round. So whoever at libp2p is in charge of collecting public goods funding, talk to me after, and let's do this. And ICOs that have a bunch of different names these days. No one uses that term anymore, but they are alive and well and happening every day out there. And venture capital. So yeah, it turns out there's a lot of VCs that invest in open source software, so I added them here. The kind of scale of public goods funding did hit a peak in the last cycle, but it's coming back, actually. The slide is probably already a month or two out of date, so yeah, I would say that that may no longer be the case as more and more ecosystems are launching their own PGF programs. Filecoin today, Cello just launched one a couple weeks ago, and more ecosystems. Solana's talking about it, but haven't seen much material coming out of it yet. But more and more ecosystems are talking about this and actually allocating funding towards a decentralized community governance allocation system. So looking at like how the landscape is looking, how to source funding, I think it is always good to diversify the funding types that one is dependent on, because in this world, often funding is available and then suddenly not available, often due to the price of a token of a specific ecosystem or for other reasons, changes in governance. There is a growing retroactive funding movement that is, I think, relatively new in Web3, but it's growing very quickly. And something that has been, it's very, very rudimentary in development stage, is actually evaluating the impact of public goods funding. So there are some incredible teams out of Network Goods, mainly Open Source Observer, that's doing great work that was adopted by the last Optimism Retro PGF round. But this kind of area is still very early, and I would say the vast majority of funds distributed through these channels are just sprayed out there, and there's no accountability. And I think there's like huge inefficiencies in the current system. And so, yeah, these kinds of tools can really make a difference in terms of making sure that funding reaches the places that it will have the most impact. Okay, breaking down grants a little bit more. There are plenty of grants going into Web3 from larger institutional players, even governments, larger philanthropic institutions. Gates Foundation, I've seen funding open source before, but those cycles are very long. There's a lot of paperwork going into applying for those grants, and often it does help to have contacts. I think that's probably always the case in any of these systems. Then there are Web3 specific ecosystem grants that are much more bound to a specific ecosystem. And similarly, DAO Treasury grants that are more decentrally administered, but with similar objectives, funding a specific Web3 ecosystem. And then the benevolent billionaires. So this is like, if you can find one, that's really good, because you only have to sell one person and then they write a check, and it could be good for like 3 years. But again, it's like really difficult to have that access. So, this slide is out of proportion, but Retro PGF, yeah, again, Filecoin launched one today. Cello is launching a Retro PGF, and I think their ecosystems like libp2p and IPFS should be going after various protocols for funding and diversifying. And I think, yeah, it's a great time to start doing that. Keep going. Yeah, we talked about airdrops a little bit. I think that the science of distributing airdrops as a protocol is very rudimentary, and it's a pretty inefficient one, but again, not to be ignored. It's in the billions of dollars already this year, and we're not even through February. And then open source dependency funding, touched on that already. So crowdfunding, there's donation-based models, so both quadratic funding and the model that I mentioned earlier with Octant and staking. These systems require a lot of marketing and outreach to community. So there's a lot of work in terms of building your community up beforehand and doing like direct outreach, like intensely over Telegram, Twitter, whatever. Unless like libp2p, many community members already recognize you, and in those cases, maybe the let's say the Gitcoin community will be familiar and donate without the need for intensive outreach. But in my experience, those campaigns are very time consuming. And then if there isn't a large kind of matching grant, it's not always like a good kind of payback for the time invested. Staking, I came across an interesting model yesterday, actually. It's a new protocol called Morpheus, and they've been running a basically similar to Octant, staking ETH and donating, or not, donating is not the right word, contributing the yields into a pool. It reminds me a little bit of the DAO many years ago, because as I understand, there's not team tokens. It's basically people contributing to a pool and then open source developers collectively managing that pool. And they are open sourcing all the contracts that they're using on mor20.org. So that might be an interesting new form of bootstrapping protocols. Yeah, I talked about ICOs. I did one a few years ago. I can't necessarily recommend it. It's pretty complex legally, always evolving. You have to be very up to the times, and generally that's expensive legally. And there's a lot of risk. There's also the fact that once you have many token holders, it's a psychological burden on the founder, because they're always going to be talking to you, looking at you, and asking you what's happening. On the other hand, it is an effective way to distribute collective ownership. And it's good for bull markets, which we're going into one. Yeah, there's a bunch of names for it. The names are always evolving, but these are happening every day, and it's still a very effective way to fundraise. Not like it was in 2017, but it still works. And then venture capital. So yeah, this is a weird one, because why would VCs that want to capture value fund public goods and open source? And arguably, yeah, this is kind of a debate that I like to have with Scott Moore, one of the founders of Gitcoin. And yeah, I won't go too much into it right now, but Gitcoin itself has a token and was funded in part by venture capital. So it is an interesting model. I would argue strongly that Gitcoin is a public good. So to finish the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about funding the commons and what we're doing in the public goods funding ecosystem. So again, we run conferences, hackathons, and residencies for open source developers to come together and build public goods. We're working on building a flywheel or virtuous cycle, bringing together protocols and teams across Web3, individual contributors and builders, and both philanthropic and venture funders, as well as a new experimental breed of funders that we're about to start working with, that will be able to speculate on impact and retroactively receive rewards if the project being speculated on receives retroactive PGF. So it's a way for projects that think they have a good shot at receiving retroactive public goods funding to get speculative proactive funding, and then later pay out their, let's call them lenders. So next, Funding the Commons is in the San Francisco Bay Area. Hope that some of you guys can make it, and I want to feature libp2p team members that are fundraising. So if any of those are in the audience, talk to me, and let's figure out how to, yeah, perfect. So we'll have 1 day on funding open source and 1 day on open source and decentralized AI. Our next one will be in Tokyo in July, and the final one of the year will be in Bangkok in November. We'll also run a residency, month-long co-living residency for open source developers, most likely in Thailand in October. And that's it. I have a link to the State of Web3 grants report. If that's interesting to anyone, happy to share it. Just like a catalog of all the grants out there available. And yeah, I don't know if we have time for questions, but thank you.